interested in making this top, Lekala 5766, stay tuned. Video is just about, because the pattern looks a little intimidating. It's not very many pieces, which I talk about in the video a little bit. And these are the instructions. There's only 9 steps, and it requires you to have a little bit of sewing knowledge. If you've sewn a shirt before, you should be able to do this. But I thought that it looked a little intimidating. So this is what the pattern looks like. Well, actually it's bigger than that. So there's 3 pleats across the front, and it has these edges. So what I'm trying to explain to you in the video is I didn't mark any of these lines onto my fabric. All I did was put a little snip in for the notches that are on here. And the thing that I did was I started at this pleat. So when you fold that over, it's going to line up with your shoulder. So that's your first pleat. So I just lined up my notches and made sure my seam allowance is lined up. I'm going to fold the placket over so you get the general idea. There. So that's what it should look like when you sew it down. So your placket is folded over and all your seam allowance lines up. And this part, I didn't cut that out, and that's what you're seeing there, sticking out. But it lines up, and your seam allowance, I folded this roughly, but you get the general, hopefully you get the general idea of how this, because it just looks more complicated than it is. It's just 3 pleats. And if you can get your seam allowance to line up and look like that, from that, you're golden. That's probably the hardest part about this whole top. So I'll probably end up editing more stuff out of this video. Okay. Here it is, me sewing it together. Pattern layout, so the back is all in one piece, the collar, and the front. So 2 fronts, 1 back, 2 collars. So I have the back cut out, and this is what the front looks like right here. Hopefully you can see that. So these are the instructions. There's 9 instructions, 9 steps. So I have cut, so I'm just going to show you some of the pattern. These are what the notches look like right here. So hopefully the buttonholes. So this is the placket. So you need a piece of interfacing. So I cut a piece of interfacing. It says to only cut one for one side. I assume it's the buttonhole side. Now I got my pattern with seam allowance. So that's what this line is here, is the seam allowance. And this is the seam allowance here, and these are the notches. So there's 3 pleats, so there's 1, 2, and 3 pleats. So this would be the placket, which fold over twice, I assume. So, and so it comes with 1 centimeter seam. So if you get it printed off that way, I think you have to pay like 50 cents to have the seam allowance added on. So this is what the pattern looks like with seam allowance. Side is the side the buttonholes go in. So I sewed my interfacing on, which went to there. So then I pressed it. I sewed it in because I don't have iron on. So I serged this edge, which you don't have to do because it's going to be tucked in. So it's folded twice, like on the pattern, and I pressed it. So I'm going to have to run a row of stitching along this part right here. So that's the placket. So then, right there. So I ran a row of stay stitching, or running stitches, my largest stitch on my sewing machine. Can you see that? So I ran a row of stitching there, and then I pressed it. So there's my placket. So I'm gonna have to sew this down. So then after I ironed that, got that ready to go, try and put this where you can see. You can see this long piece. So I found it easier to start with the pleat farthest away from the placket, which is this one. So you know it's going to have to line up with your corner of your shoulder. So I lined that up. So I didn't mark the back of this. None of this is marked, is the reason why I'm telling you this. So I just have my little notches here. Can you see that I put a little splice in there? And same with here. That's one of the notches. There's another notch. I just put a little clip in. And it's the same on the bottom. You have these clips right here. So that's what I did. So I lined up this first one. Let's see if I can get you to go down a little further. So I lined up this first one. Then there is a clip in here, I believe. The second one is it has to be all in the seam allowance. And then the third one. And then there's the placket. So there's my 3 pleats right there. Alright, okay. So there's the pleats. I stay stitched the front part here, where all the pleats are. And this is what the right side looks like. It's time to sew the shoulder seams together, and I did stay stitch the neckline because I wanted to see if it's going to fit, and it looks like it is going to. And so I'm going to sew across here. It says in the instructions, instruction number 4 says stitch shoulder edges, press seams backward and neaten them. So I'm going to sew my shoulder seams, and I'm going to, I suppose you could French seam them if you wanted to. I'm going to serge mine. Step is stitch outer stand up collar into the neckline, fold inner stand up open edge under, and stitch it along joining seam. So I already did that to my collar, but I have to sew it onto the garment. And I have my piping. They call it piping, I call it binding. I cut mine. It says to cut them 4 to 5 centimeters wide. I cut mine at 1 3/4, which is almost 4 centimeters. That's the size of binding I like to use, 1 3/4 inch, which is 4 centimeters. So I'm going to do that, and then you sew the side seams together. All right, let's see how I get on. Okay, so I think the last place we left off was the shoulder seam. So that is sewn together at the shoulder. I serged it. Then I sewed the collar on. So there's my iron down piece there. And there, I still have to trim the inside seam. Excuse me. So there's the collar sewn to the garment. So I have to attach that by hand stitching or basting or both, sewing and whatever. So now I am binding the side, the armhole. So this is what I do. I cut a piece of bias of the same fabric that I already had. I cut it on the bias, 1 3/4 inch wide, or 4 centimeters. And then I sew the pieces together if I need pieces, or I have one long strip, and I iron it flat. I just fold it in half and iron it. Then I sew it after it's pressed, right sides together. I just sew along the seam allowance. I sewed along the armhole opening, and I just used a 1/4 inch seam, which isn't quite a centimeter, because by the time, that's all that you're allowed anyway, is a centimeter, and by the time I turn this. So I have this sewn on, the binding sewn on here to the right side. I am now going to understitch with the seam pressed towards the opening, like so. I'm going to understitch along here, and then I'll press it again, and then I will sew it, the binding down on the inside. So you will have a row of stitching, or you could hand sew it if you wanted to. But I'm going to understitch it so that it doesn't roll out. I am going to sew this on the machine, the understitching, and then I'll have a row right here. Because there is some top stitching on this top, and I don't think it's gonna matter. And then you sew the side seams together and then hem it. Right, I'll be back. I think where we left off was we were doing the armholes and then the side seam. So this is the worst armhole that I did. So you sew your binding on. That's what it looks like on the outside of here. And I just bar tacked that down. And you can't even really tell that it's under the arm. Nobody's gonna look. Nobody's gonna say, I don't think you made the pattern correctly. It's not gonna happen. So, well, you might on here, but if you're just wearing it, people aren't gonna come up to you and say, oh, I think you could have done a better job. So that's what obviously you can choose to hand stitch that if you don't like that, but I don't think that shows up very much. I hand stitched the collar, is all hand stitched down. This is the inside. So that's all hand stitched. And then the hem. So I did serge it and then I rolled it twice because the shirt is not super long, and then I couldn't do that. So I think the best way would be to bias bind the edge bottom. So that's probably the worst. I left an opening in my placket at the bottom so I could sew it like that, like you turn it inside out and then sew across. So that is the worst part of the hem, is where the pleats were, because I couldn't roll them twice. It's just too thick. So I think a bias binding would work really well for a hem on this. But nobody's gonna see it. That's what it looks like on the outside. So the next thing is buttonholes, and of course my top buttonhole messed up. I took it out, I redid it, and it still is, anyway, you can't tell because I got a big button on it. So I am gonna try it on and see what you think of it. So this is the top. It's quite wide. I put on these decorative buttons. I only have 2 of these, so I just put one up here, and they actually don't even match, but I don't think you can tell. And yeah, I kind of like it. It fits because, I don't know, it's a little different. It's a very loose fitting top, and sleeveless. Very comfortable, lightweight. Anyway, I tried it. I think I like it. You enjoyed that, and I will be talking to you again soon. Take care, everyone. Bye.